So this week, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi made an explosive visit to Taiwan. She's the highest-ranking US official to visit Taiwan for 25 years, and quite predictably, this has enraged Beijing, which claims ownership of the territory. They've started an unprecedented 6 days of military exercises and have effectively mounted a air and sea blockade of Taiwan as a result of this visit. I mean, Tom, what have you made of this trip? What exactly is it supposed to have achieved?
Well, it seems to have achieved a burnishing of Nancy Pelosi's own credentials. It's been openly talked about as something that she has wanted to do as kind of part of her legacy, given that I don't think anyone expects to be in politics for that many more years at this point in time. And the sheer narcissism and recklessness of it, I think, is really quite striking. It's an open secret that there was this disagreement between Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi about whether or not she would go. These comments which have made it out into the press about Biden saying that it was against the military advice. They didn't think it was a good idea, which is a profound
not a good idea, the exact quote.
Yeah. And yet we're expected to believe that he couldn't have put a stop to it. And it's this balance which has been struck for decades now, which is that there is this what they call strategic ambiguity. So there's obviously robust relations between Taiwan and the US. Obviously a lot of support, but formally they don't recognize it as, again, a kind of separate entity, so as not to enrage the People's Republic of China. And to just kind of throw that out because of a desire to pose on the world stage is really quite striking. And there was a good article in The Economist about this, which said that, this isn't strategic ambiguity, this is strategic confusion. And we've seen this in recent times with this Biden administration as well, in relation to the question of Taiwan, first and foremost. Again, Biden is now kind of seemingly concerned about trying to strike this balance, but back in the spring, he was in Japan, heavily indicated that he would potentially militarily intervene if China did anything. Again, comments that to be walked back. And of course, we saw it with Ukraine as well. Him calling Putin a butcher, him letting slip when he was addressing people in Poland that Putin cannot be allowed to remain in power. And again, these comments having to be walked back. And the explanation for it, which I think is really striking, and you kind of see it similarly with the discussion of Nancy Pelosi's trip, is that, this is just something they feel quite passionately about. That's not how you conduct yourself on the world stage when you are representing the leading superpower and you're dealing with a tinderbox like Taiwan. But for whatever reason, because we have this kind of narcissistic, this incredibly reckless, and to be honest, very confused administration, we're starting to see this horrendous situation, which you have this incredibly incoherent, confused, reckless foreign policy from the United States at a time when global tensions haven't been as high as this for many, 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 many years. And it's just a really alarming combination.
Yeah, there are kind of two quotes that are always kind of ringing in my mind, especially around when the Biden administration kind of assumed power. One is the adults are back in the room. Gone are the days of reckless Trump stirring up tensions. And the other was a quote from Biden himself saying, diplomacy is back. Diplomacy is going to be at the heart of our foreign policy. And yet, time and again, it's either Biden himself or someone from, someone close to him, like Nancy Pelosi, just tripping over these tripwires or gleefully running through them a lot of the time. In this case, in Taiwan, that's not a slip of the tongue to arrange a visit. Ella, what have you made of it?
Yeah, that you think back to Trump's presidency and how everybody thought it was so horrendous, the way in which he openly talked about China in that weird way that he pronounced China, and and how sort of upfront he was about his kind of not boosterism, but sort of an aggressive approach to international diplomacy. But the one thing you could say about it was that you knew what he was doing. Yeah. You knew what the policy was. You knew what his tone meant. It was very clear what his kind of aims were to a certain extent. And the thing, Tom raised an important point. The thing about diplomacy, international diplomacy, and how it works is that you have to have a coherent understanding within your own nation of how you as a political group are going to approach other nations. And the thing about the Biden administration at the moment is, putting aside the kind of increasingly concerning issues around whether or not Biden is actually fit to play the role that he's playing in terms of, his slip of the tongues in Parliament, also saying things like, other troops will find out when they get there. Like making the most.
We'll see you when you get there.
Unbelievable.
He's famously said.
Yeah, mistakes that he doesn't understand. It's like he doesn't understand how powerful actually the president of the United States saying things like this still is on the world stage. He's treating it sort of very superficially. But that having an agreement within your own kind of politicians is important to how you look to other nations. So if China, if Beijing's watching on and looking at the Biden administration at the moment, it's a bit like what happened when, Putin was looking on at what's going on in Europe and within the UK and other European nations and thinking, these people don't know, how to run their own countries, let alone how to intervene in other nations and how to engage on the kind of geopolitical stage. And you might be thinking, now's my time. Now, I don't think we should be too alarmist about what's going on in relation to Beijing's kind of warmongering stance. But, performance matters. That if you have politicians who don't understand the seriousness of international diplomacy and, when to say quiet things in quiet and when to say loud things out loud, then you end up blundering into not World War III, but some kind of international conflict, which is ultimately, at the end of it, going to be terrible for Taiwanese people. And that shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Tom, do you want to add?
Well, I think it's just as you were saying, Fraser, the kind of contrast between what this particular administration said that it was going to bring us back to and what has actually been the reality is really, really striking. I mean, I remember during the Trump transition, I believe, when he took a call from the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, and everyone lost their shit. They were like, how could he have not known this? How could he have realised that this wasn't going to rock the boat? And yet now we see a provocation as large as this. And of course, all right-thinking people will support Taiwan, its democracy and its right to self-determination. But at the same time, this isn't a game.
Yeah.
This isn't a stage on which you virtue signal and throw up slogans because of the fact that there are very real consequences to those kinds of actions, very real threats of escalation, and a very delicate balance here which needs to be maintained. And I think it would be one thing if there was a decision on the part of the US to really rattle China's cage. But this has happened almost accidentally.
Yeah.
They're expecting us to believe that it's just a bit of freelancing on Pelosi's case, which it seems like it is. But at the same time, you cannot have a situation where someone in the presidential line of succession is just doing things because it feels right.
Or good for her career.
Or works in terms of something that she's obviously been very concerned about. Taiwan has been an issue of hers for a very long time, and China has been a sort of bête noire of hers for a very long time. This is not the adults returning to the room, as you were saying. The stakes really couldn't be higher, and yet we are left with these kind of bumbling, geriatric, unserious politicians, and that's a real danger for the world.